In this lesson, we'll take a few moments to learn what the function of shading networks are when it comes to Maya. Okay, fantastic. So I've got a very simple shading network here in front of me, and let's go ahead and just start off this lesson by answering a few questions. So if this is your first time dealing with shading networks, you may find yourself wondering, what exactly is a shading network? Well, a shading network here inside of Maya is simply the method by which we give our models any kind of a look. So in front of me, again, I have a very, very simple shading network, and kind of the way this works is what we have here on the far right is basically a surface material. Now, this material, as you can see here, has a very distinct look to it. We have kind of this black grid with these orange squares, and we kind of have these little bulging type of an effect going on with these particular orange squares. Now, the very interesting thing about this is that this particular material contains none of this information on its own. It's receiving all of this information from additional nodes in the shading network here. So you can see here that basically if we wanted to assign this material to a particular part of a model, we can do that, but we can completely control the way this material looks through the nodes that we begin to create and attach to it here. Now, there's a very sort of specific order that these nodes are actually plugged in here. Each one of these nodes does a very, very specific thing. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the color here first. So obviously we have orange squares and kind of these black grid lines on this little preview sphere. Now, this color information is being received from this texture node right down here. You can see we have sort of this grid texture node. Now, there is a node attached to that. We're going to talk a little bit more about how these nodes attach and kind of the flow of information when it comes to these connections. But this place 2D texture node here is basically controlling the number of divisions in the grid, the placement of the grid, the rotation of the grid, things that have to do with the way the grid is applied to the surface. Now, when I come up here to this sort of top portion of our shading network, you'll see there's three additional nodes here. Now, the first node here is the Bump 2D node. Now, you'll notice, again, in our preview, this material has sort of an inflated look to it, almost a very bumpy look. So this type of a bump effect is basically created by this string of nodes right here. Now, this node right here is going to control sort of the intensity of that bump effect. Basically, it's this is kind of the actual node that says the information past me should be applied as bump information. Now, the information past this node is basically the pattern of the bump information. You can see we have another texture right here. Kind of looks like a grid like we have down here, except it's not very crisp. This particular texture is called a bulge. Now, attached to this particular texture is this Place 2D texture node. And again, this texture is performing pretty much the exact same function as this Place 2D texture node right down here. Only this particular texture is connected to this bulge, or rather this particular node is connected to this bulge texture. So you can see here how basically the way this particular bulge texture looks is greatly controlled by this placement node. Well, this texture is then told to be bump information over here and told how intense to be applied to the material through this bump node. And that information is fed over here to our surface material. So you can see really how using a shading network is a very, very modular way of working. And ultimately, this form of working is actually very, very powerful and very flexible when it comes to creating a certain look for a particular model you're working on. All right, great. With that said, let's go ahead and move on to our next lesson, and we'll learn about the hypershade.